Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. So before we get started, don't forget to go and get yourself that perfect drink that you enjoy drinking, or a lovely warm cup of cocoa, because I've got a phenomenal story for you tonight that you're really going to love. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was early winter, and the weather had made her mark on the beguiling landscape. Trees had long since abandoned their leaves, unless they were wise enough to wear evergreen coats, and the cold weather had set in with a vengeance and anchored her roots quite firmly into the ground. The grass had become stone-washed, as the cold weather had confiscated its verdant glamour, and now carpets of snow had begun to powder the streets. But the snow was becoming heavier and heavier with every passing minute. The sky looked gloomy. It was stained with a grey apparel, and the distant panoramic mountains were heavily swathed in a glistening white glaze. There was a biting nip to the air, a chill that could quite literally sink into your bones. The local weather forecasts were warning of heavy snowfall, encouraging people not to travel or leave their homes. But I couldn't allow my life to be dictated to by the weather. I had a business to run, so for me I didn't have the luxury of turning in early for the day. I didn't want to lose out on any potential sales, no matter how scant they might be. By all accounts, all my customers on days like this, when the sunshine was a distant dream, could only ever harp about one thing: the weather. "Isn't it cold?" were the three words that were the order of the day, and the words most frequently spoken on every street corner. At the time, I was working in a stunning avant-garde clothing boutique in a rural North American mountain town. And let's just say business was booming, and certainly in the latter part of the day, which had surprised me considerably, as this was not the kind of day that you would expect to attract shoppers. The weather was absolutely freezing. It was snowing outside, with heavy snowflakes thrusting themselves audaciously through the ashy sky, so that the streets and sidewalks were heavily barraged with snow. Let's just say, based from my vast experience over years of selling designer clothes, I have found people are reluctant to shop when the weather is cold, as they tend to hate taking off their clothes or trying on garments in freezing conditions. And quite frankly, who can blame them for that? I'm much the same myself. I'm a wimp when it comes to the cold weather. So removing as little clothing as possible in Arctic conditions is a natural inborn instinct that serves our best interests. Perhaps it's a survival instinct within all of us. Fortunately, I make my shop as warm as toast so that people would be less hesitant to try on some of my designer creations. I try every trick in the book to arrest people's attention by dressing up my mannequins to look as stylish as possible, so people less inclined to try something on might have a radical change of mind. I know when customers try on my clothes, they're incredibly flattering, so they're more likely to be persuaded to buy one of my garments that regretfully don't come very cheap. I tend to find that the summer and spring trade in clothing boutiques flourishes when the weather warms up. It's at thrilling times like this, when out come the wallets and the money, as people become enthusiastic about spending. But in winter those wallets don't appear to be as eager to burn any holes in people's pockets, although I do my damnedest to get people to spend money in any way I can, but it's not easy. On this particular occasion, I had been more than pleasantly surprised with all the bustling passing trade that had trudged into my boutique. It had been an auspicious serendipitous day, based on the numbers of people that had bought clothes from me. Indeed, it had been so busy, I hadn't even shut up shop for a 15-minute snack break. I decided there had to be something in the water, as over and over again, my cash register was pinging with new purchases, and customers left my shop with smiling, satisfied faces and large pink cardboard bags containing their purchases that were elegantly wrapped in tissue paper and with the curly designer logo of my shop on the front. "I love your clothes," I heard from the customers again and again. "They're so different. They're so unique." I always knew when I started my own boutique that it was very significant to stand out as being different. The problem is if you produce a clothing range, much like your competitors, you'll be just run-of-the-mill, like any other clothing shop. People get excited when they're presented with inspirational, innovative options, and that's what I like to do with my garments, that are all made here in North America by skilled seamstresses. I think my clothes have that vintage 50s look with a modern twist to them, which people rarely like, as it's an understated classic elegance that is very feminine and always flattering. I hasten to say, it was already getting dark outside. The sunlight had been vacuumed away by the dull sky. The snow was coming down furiously, being blown by a wind into drifts, and it was impertinently intruding into shop doorways. I was about to close up in any moment and get back home as soon as I possibly could, contemplating the dreadful drive that lay ahead of me with very little enthusiasm. I hated driving when it was dark and loathed driving in hazardous conditions like this. The street with all the shop lights on had a Christmas feel about it that was so magical, so the lights twinkled like Christmas trees against the contrasting white snow. I was counting up the takings in my cash register when a mother and her daughter, who were from California, came barging into my boutique like two bulls in a china shop. Even the bell in my doorway that tingled when the customers entered the shop seemed to be particularly clamorous, as if it too had not been unaffected by this rude, fortuitous intrusion. I had never met two such ungainly, bumbling women, who literally derailed everything that they touched. Most of the local businesses had closed shop for the day, apart from a coffee shop further along the way, that was doing a bustling, busy trade, as coffee and lattes and their warm cinnamon buns that no one could resist were doing a fine trade. You could smell the cinnamon all day down the street. I would have closed up shop sooner, but I could tell by the women's expensive designer handbags they were carrying, and the hungry, eager looks on their faces, that these women intended to spend money and meant business. I was hardly going to look a gift horse in the mouth, as I could smell that cash, and the scent was sweeter than sugar candy. I could feel the familiar fluttering of excitement in my heart that always instinctively happened when I sensed a large sale was brewing. The older woman was considerably larger than her daughter. Her weight ballooned magnanimously around her middle in several rolls like a hilly valley, while her daughter was slender, her figure neat. They both had fabulous manicures and hair highlighted with hundreds of reds, hazelnuts and blondes, while their makeup was plastered on so thickly, like a warrior's war paint. "It's not too late, is it?" trills the older woman, looking at me with eyes fraught with worry. "No, I'm still open," I said, giving them a warm, encouraging smile. "Please feel free to browse through my stuff, and if you need any help, don't hesitate to give me a shout. Our newest additions are over there on the right-handed rack." The two lumbering women needed no further prompting, as they gracelessly crashed into the rails of clothes, clumsily dismantling many dresses from their racks, and neatly folded sweaters came colliding onto the floor in puddles. But the uncouth woman remained oblivious to the cumbersome chaos they were causing, and I didn't particularly care if indeed they were going to spend money. They acted like two klutzy, excited people that are ruffling with butter fingers through clothes at a jumble sale, determined to get the very best bargains. "May I try these on?" says the woman, inelegantly holding up a pile of clothes in her hands, so thick that I nearly passed out from shock at the quantity of clothes she was showing me. I nodded in bemusement. "Go ahead," I said. The younger daughter did much the same, and to my horror the two uncoordinated women decided to change in the middle of the shop floor, tearing their clothes off and standing in front of me in their undies, completely unself-conscious. In truth, I admired their brazen audacity, as I'd never be so bold to behave so presumptuously. So to see this confidence in other people, I couldn't help but secretly admire it. I'd have loved to have been so self-assured myself. I'm that typical shy girl that hides behind the closet when I get dressed. But not them. They were happy to hang out their dirty laundry, no matter how stained or imperfect it was, for the entire world to see, with no apologies and definitely no shame. "It's easier to dress here," explained the older woman. "No one's going to come into the shop this late, so why bother to change in the changing rooms? It's only going to create more fuss." I decided not to say anything, as the two women tried on clothes and cack-handishly threw stuff they didn't want onto the floor, which I hurriedly picked up after them fastidiously, replacing it back on the shelves and the hangers. But I don't know why I even bothered. as those two oafish women would be back at the racks again, rifling through the clothes. They were like two starving homeless people outside a bakery dumpster, diving for all the baked goods that had been tossed out the day before. There was an excitable energy in the shop that was infectious, as both mother and daughter spurred each other on. I'm afraid to say there wasn't a single item of clothing in my shop safe from their clutches, as everything on display was at serious risk of being trampled to death by two trumpeding, lumbering elephants, and the slimmer woman may as well have been as large as a male elephant herself, as she was so ham-handed with everything, and probably even more graceless than her mother, if that were at all possible. I watched in stunned silence as the two women paraded the clothes in front of me, like a fashion show, on which I had become the commentator, or the cheering crowd, if you like. The mature woman kept looking up at me and saying, "Does this make me look fat?" "Of course not," I'd lie. "You look perfectly lovely." The truth was the bigger woman looked fat in everything, which was no fault of the clothes. But to be fair, she looked good in what she did try on, and that is what mattered at the end of the day. The slimmer daughter was squealing in delight as she tried on all my clothes. It didn't surprise me, of course, that she looked $1 million in everything, but she was like a clothes horse who could model anything she liked and looked terrific, but she knew it. "Oh, Mum, look at this," her daughter would say, twirling around as she stared at her reflection in the mirror over and over again. I knew that this was a young woman that loved to gaze at her reflection. She was in love with it, but then the mirror did not lie, and it seemed to agree with her that she did indeed look great. "Oh, darling, you look quite wonderful," her mother purred, looking up at me proudly. "Hasn't she got the most marvellous figure? Everything in the right place. I do envy her, you know. I was once as slim as her, but after childbirth, everything headed south. You know how it does. The same will happen to her after she's had her first baby, as I keep telling her, but she's so naively ignorant about those kind of things, as they all are at this age. They all seem to think they'll be thin forever." "Yes, she's got a lovely figure," I say. "Everything looks perfectly lovely on her." "But then, that being said, my daughter would look great in a sack," the woman continued. "But in your clothes, I have to say she looks like a princess. I must admit the cuts of your clothing make even a big woman like myself look good. It's not easy to find such forgiving clothes, you know." "That's because a good cut can really transform your appearance," I said. The daughter looked at her mother, with a big frown on her face, as if she was faced with a dreadful problem. "What is it, sweetheart? You look so confounded. Whatever is the matter?" "I don't know what dress to choose, Mum. I like them all." She paused for a moment, putting on a very sorrowful face, and a big tear spilled down her cheeks. "I don't want to have to choose, Mum. I like all these clothes. How can I possibly just only choose one?" "Sweetheart, don't you dare cry. I can't bear to see you so distressed. If you like all those clothes, then we'll take them all. There's no big deal about it." The daughter's face visibly relaxed, but I knew that she knew that this is exactly what her mother would say. She probably turned on the waterworks like a tap whenever she wanted to get her own way, as she had masterfully figured out how to manipulate her mother with a superbly alarming success. I'm quite sure if her mother had said no, she would have sulked and wailed all the way back home. She looked the type who always got her way. Before long, there is the most massive pile of clothes stashed up at my cash register, but there are equally as many spilled on the floor, and my poor little boutique looks like it's suffering from the aftermath of a great tsunami, and my two customers were the thunderous waves that had turned my shop into a sad wasteland. It was incredible. "We are from California," the woman told me. "We're going back in the morning. We saw your shop yesterday, but we couldn't come in, as we were going on a hike. I have to tell you, we could never find such a gloriously unique boutique like yours in California. So many of the clothes there are much the same, but your boutique is very vintage, but with the modern twist, and I really love it. I'm glad you like it. My object is to sell clothes you can't find anywhere else. People like to stand out from the crowd, you know." "My friends in California are going to be so jealous," said the daughter, smugly. "But I ain't going to tell them about your shop. Me and my mother will be coming back very soon when you bring out your new ranges." When the mature woman pays for their garments, she opens up her oversized Gucci bag and brings out piles and piles of cash tied up neatly in tight little bundles, almost as if she's robbed a bank. I'm amazed that anyone would dare walk around carrying so much cash, but I say nothing, and happily ring up the transaction, my eyes popping out of my heads at the huge amount they've spent with me. But I'm not complaining. I'm over the moon. It was a pleasure doing business with you. I hope to see you again, I say to the two women, as they walk out of the shop, weighed down heavily by dozens of my pink bags. I was certainly very glad of their custom, but my goodness, my store looked like a bomb site. I knew I couldn't leave it in this condition for my shop assistant in the morning. And the clothes also risked becoming crumpled, lying strewn over the polished floor like this. My shop assistant would almost certainly believe that our boutique had been raided during the night, or a whole herd of trumpeting elephants had invaded our shop. It was hard to believe that two women could cause such pandemonium, and it did leave me wondering what their hotel room looked like. I had visions of the cleaners entering their room to be greeted by suitcases bursting at the seams with clothes spilling out and trespassing rudely over every available surface. And I was certain their bathroom was covered in lipsticks, eyeshadow palettes and mascaras, and there was possibly no area that had not been contaminated by all their stuff. Still, I shouldn't complain. I had made a whopping sale, and I was incredibly glad about that. It took me a long while to clean up the mess in my boutique, as I folded up sweaters neatly, replacing them on shelves, and hung up dresses according to their sizes. I then finally cashed up, and so by the time I closed the shop up, there was not a single soul in sight. All the shops along the street were lighted up, but everyone had long since abandoned their stores. And even a coffee shop and local restaurant had thought better about staying open on a perilous night like this, when the weather was not your friend. I was, of course, the only mug that had decided that I would shut up shop so late. My boyfriend Jonathan was not best pleased with me, and kept sending me urgent text messages telling me to hurry back home, in case things get much worse. "Have you listened to the weather forecast?" he chided. "The weather is treacherous. They're saying no one should be out on the roads. What's keeping you so long?" "I told you," I texted back. "I had a late customer, well, 2 customers, who bought the shop. Don't you worry, I'll be back soon." "Make sure you drive back safely," came the swift reply. I noticed that there were no cars in the parking bay. Everything was swathed under magnanimous blankets of snow. The world was richly carpeted in white, with the naked bronzed boughs of the trees heavily laden with glistening white icicles. It was so quiet outside that the extreme soundless silence was deafening, although the snow continued to flurry down in a very audacious snowstorm that seemed determined to persist in its folly. I knew Jonathan was right, and that the roads could potentially be treacherous, but I was judicious enough to have all-weather tyres on my Land Rover, so I was certain I'd be all right. I made my way to my truck, having put on sensible walking shoes and a puffy windbreaker over my jeans. It was freezing cold, and the icy chill of the bracing wind numbed my fingers, despite the fact that my hands were swathed in thick fleece-lined gloves, designed to keep out the winter chill. I sat in the car to warm up the engine, and then with my ice scraper I got outside and scraped away the snow from my windscreen. I was now ready to go home, and sitting comfortably in the leather seats of my car, with my safety belt buckled. I pressed down the accelerator and made my way cautiously down the road, with the radio blaring. "I can't stress enough, be circumspect, folks. The weather out there is exceedingly treacherous. If you're out and about, drive very carefully. And if you can possibly avoid making any journeys now, you would be well advised to do so. It is far better to stay safely at home and to listen to some of the music that we have in line for you to keep you so entertained you won't regret keeping tuned in with us." When I left the cheerful lights of the town, it became tenebrously dark, and without the background lights to offer me comfort and reassurance, I began to panic. I knew this journey was a mistake, but it was too late. I was on the road now. It might have been wiser for me to stay at the shop. I had a pop-up mattress there, along with a sleeping bag, especially accessible for such occasions as this. And there was a little kitchenette with a fridge stocked with food, It would have been much wiser for me to stay there than brace these foreboding elements that greeted me with the insidious charm of an ice queen, hell-bent on extracting her ultimate revenge on me. The beastly weather was extreme, which was unusually freakish for this time of the year. Now I was on higher ground, I was greeted to an unfriendly blizzard, and the snowflakes were so big and so thick that I had to lean forward and peer through the windscreen to see my way ahead. And even in my robust truck, I was very afraid that I would veer off the narrow road. I was moving towards my home in a rural location, nestled against the imposing views of the panoramic mountains. But I could see nothing now. There wasn't a single truck on the road, and I suddenly felt so terribly alone, so isolated. It was most distressing. I drove this route every single day of my life, but now I felt disorientated, very confused. Everything had become ambiguously obscure, locked under the tenebrous blanket of an unforgiving dark night, where the stiff-necked moon had perversely hidden herself behind cloud cover and had become terribly shy. It would seem her timorous cousins, the stars, also shrunk back into their shells like frightened tortoises and simply refused to shine. So there was an airy, inauspicious feeling about this bodefully oppressive night that sent a chill transcending down my spine and a bitter taste interloping in the back of my throat. I suddenly came to the horrifying revelation that I was lost, but I still proceeded forward, hoping with bated breath that something would be recognisable to me sooner or later. Soon I came to an unfamiliar crossroads where I changed gears and prepared to stop, as the last thing I wanted to do was to apply my brakes and start skidding. Where the hell was I? I felt as if I was playing blind man's buff, as out here everything under the grim shadow of darkness clandestinely stole the definitive details of the familiar landmarks with a hungry gluttony. It was hard to discern anything. It was like everything looked the same, as the whole landscape was buried under this thick snow, and the charmless night did little to make visibility clear. In my bright headlights I saw trees on both sides of the road, thick congregations of spruce trees. I was certain I missed a vital turning somewhere along the way. I could not get a cell phone connection, as a GPS signal is often difficult to receive in the mountains. I decided that the right-hand turning looked more familiar than the left, so I veered down that road, but to my horror the snowdrifts here were so thick that I was certain I might get stuck. I hadn't bargained for any of the roads to be this hazardous, and I felt an encroaching sense of fear trespass upon my confidence. I told myself to get a grip and hold it together. "Don't panic," I told myself. "This isn't a train smash. You'll get through this snowstorm safely, and you'll be back home soon, drinking hot chocolate with your boyfriend and laughing about all this behind closed doors." The thought warmed the cockles of my heart, and to my surprise I discovered another set of tyre tracks in the snow and realised that, much like myself, some other foolish individual had taken it upon themselves to travel in these outrageous conditions. So my ignorance was in good company, it would seem, but maybe they'd managed to make it through, so I could do exactly the same, I told myself encouragingly. When I turned the next bend, my car almost dragooned into a truck on the side of the road. It was parked haphazardly opposite a couple of spruce trees, but it didn't appear to have crashed into anything, so what was it doing there? Maybe it was stuck, I thought, or had slewed off the road, as it was not a four-wheel drive. I immediately drove up to the car and stopped. I needed to see if anybody needed my help, or even a lift. I removed the torch from the cubbyhole in my truck and climbed out of my Land Rover. I was amazed to find that one of the doors of the stationary truck was wide open, which seemed more than a little incongruous. It was so icy out here. The wind punnelled at my cheeks. I could see footsteps from the truck leading through the spruce trees, and in the distance I could see the silhouettes of a farmhouse with its lights brightly on. I realised at once that the driver had obviously walked to the farmhouse to get help. I was about to return to my truck when I heard a cry. I immediately went to investigate and flashed my torch into the open car door of the truck, and sitting there strapped into a child-friendly seat was a little toddler. I could hardly believe my eyes. The child was wearing a blue onesie with boots. I had no idea about the age of the child. "Hello, how are you?" I said to the little one. "What's your name?" The child looked at me, beginning to whimper. My presence had grievously upset him or her. I looked around for the mother, but could not see her anywhere around, apart from the trail of footsteps that led directly through the trees towards the farmhouse. I knew at once what had happened. The mother had obviously gone to get help, but she had inadvertently left her child on the car seat. Although possibly able to walk, it wouldn't have been able to walk very far, and certainly not in those dreadful shoes it was wearing. It mortified me that the mother had forgotten to close the door behind herself in these freezing conditions outside. It seemed a nonsensical thing to do, but given the close location of the farmhouse, I was certain she would not be gone for terribly long, and would be back with reinforcements to pick up her child, but had obviously forgotten to close the door, which was a foolish mistake to make, but it could happen to any of us. I wanted to take the toddler with me back into the warmth of my own car, back to the security of my home. But if I did that, supposing I was accused of kidnapping this child? The thought horrified me. Instead, I went back to my truck and removed some blankets from the trunk, which I wrapped around the little boy or girl. I thought it might be a boy because it was dressed in a blue onesie, but you couldn't be sure. The child stared at me, saying nothing, putting its thumb into its mouth. "Your mummy won't be long," I told the toddler. "She's gone to the farmhouse to get help. She'll be back in any minute, I'm sure." I then closed the door behind me, in two minds whether I was doing the right thing or not. I studied the trail of footprints and convinced myself that the child was absolutely fine, and his mother would be back soon. I climbed somewhat reluctantly back into the Land Rover and continued the drive. The snow continued to flurry down, but I passed a barn on the corner of the road that was a conspicuous landmark I knew very well, and I sighed with relief because I knew exactly where I was, and I was very nearly home. When I drew outside the family ranch-style home, my boyfriend hurried out of the house, his face dappled with relief. "Oh, thank God you're all right. I was so worried about you. Come in before you catch your death of cold. Honestly, what are you like staying at the boutique so late in the day, with all those weather warnings?" I watched my boyfriend bustling around the range, making me some hot chocolate. He knew how much I thoroughly enjoyed the drink after a hard day's work at the boutique. I could see something bubbling on the stove. "You been cooking?" I asked in surprise. "Something smells insanely delicious." "I was very worried about you," he chided. "I had to keep myself busy, didn't I? It's chicken stew with dumplings and rice, and there's some crispy potatoes still cooking in the oven." "Have I got good taste in men or not?" I tease. "What did I do to deserve you? I must have been a saint in a previous life. You'll never believe what happened to me this evening. I was driving down that road. There were snowdrifts everywhere. I saw a truck pulled over on the side. I stopped to see if the driver was all right. I think they'd gone off to get help, but they'd left their toddler in the back seat with the door wide open. The poor thing could have frozen to death. I mean, who does that? It's insane. I think the mother in her haste must have forgotten to close the door behind her. So I put blankets on the child to keep it warm while it waited for its mother." "You mean you left the kid behind in the truck all on its own? Are you completely crazy? Why didn't you bring it back to this house with you? Have you any idea how cold it is out there? It's not good for a little one to be stuck in a car, you know." I decided not to interfere, as the mother was obviously getting help, and if she returned to find her kid missing, she'd scream blue murder. I wouldn't want to be accused of kidnapping, would I? "We need to check that the child is all right. You don't want to be accused of negligence, do you, for abandoning a child like that? We need to get to it at once. We'll leave a note in the truck for the mother, with our phone number on it, telling her that we have her kid and it's safe and well. You really should not have left her kid alone like that, even at the risk of being called a kidnapper. The child's safety is very important. And besides, you don't know if the mother did get help. It would be judicious of us to check on the child, to make sure it's absolutely all right." Thoughts of that piping hot chocolate and that delicious stew that awaited me were put on the back burner, as I reluctantly followed my boyfriend to my truck. We were taking my Land Rover, as it was still warm, and only had a thin film of snow on its windscreen that was quickly wiped away with my wipers, but I allowed Jonathan to drive, as my confidence in driving in these treacherous conditions was waning rapidly. "This is dreadful weather," says Jonathan. "Imagine being stuck here in these atrocious conditions. Thank God you've got a Land Rover with decent tyres. This road is not designed for anything less than a four-wheeler. And even that is a struggle." Our truck trailed through the thick snow. and finally we reached the car that I'd discovered earlier on. My boyfriend flashed his torchlight over the ground and remarked at the massive footprints we saw. "Bloody hell! Look at these! Look at the size of these enormous feet! There must be a giant living up there at the farmhouse." "Oh my word! You're right! They're humongous! I've never seen feet so large. They make mine look like a doll's." I was appalled at the size of the feet and secretly thought the owner of these feet could easily enter the Guinness Book of Records for the world's largest feet. I almost wanted to meet that farmer for myself, just because of the curiosity factor. "Oh my goodness gracious me! That mother still left the door wide open," said Jonathan, inspecting the back of the truck. "But the good news, I have to tell you, is that the child is finally gone, so you were absolutely right. The mother obviously came back to pick up her child. Your gut instinct was on the money." "Well, let's go back home, I say. I'm starving hungry. I could eat a horse, let alone your chicken stew." It was so wonderful to be back home. Me and Jonathan sat by a crackling fire, eating our chicken casserole and watching a lovely movie on television. We gave no further thought to the toddler that I'd seen earlier on in the evening. In truth, I felt so cosy, swaddled up in the warmth, and soon exhaustion consumed me, dictating my decision to retire to bed, as it had been a long but highly rewarding day. I was awoken in the middle of the night to hear this crashing sound. I was surprised to see that Jonathan was fast asleep and had not woken up. I was absolutely certain that one of the downstairs windows had somehow come off its hinges and was banging against the walls. The last thing I wanted was to invite any icy cold air into the house. It was cold enough already in our home. We didn't need an open window to add to the misery. I groaned in frustration. We had no central heating in our bedroom, so getting out of bed was like stepping out into a refrigerator. We had an oil-fired range, a wood-burning stove, and fireplaces throughout that kept our unusual ranch-style home warm. I say unusual because it boasted an upstairs, and most ranch-style homes are just bungalows. But on the second story there was no heating apart from our electric blanket, so I hurriedly grabbed my dressing gown, which I tied around my waist, and then I slipped my feet into my slippers as I trudged down the stairs. It was bitterly cold, and I'd have loved nothing better than to stay in bed. Thank goodness the night lights were on throughout the house, so I could see my way clearly. But to my surprise, there were no windows left open. I realized the banging sound was coming from the front door. I then discerned that someone must be there. I wasn't worried about this revelation, as we didn't have issues with crime in our part of the world, so I just assumed that someone had got stranded in the snow. It had happened before, and I've taken in strangers in my home overnight, when the weather has been so grim. It's something we mountain folk do, without even batting an eyelid. I opened the door, pulling back the latch. The wind violently thrashed through the open doorway, wailing and moaning, as it lifted up dustings of snow, so that icy cold particles brushed against my cheeks. What I see is so surreal that I'm convinced that I'm experiencing a lucid dream. Standing there in the snow is a female Bigfoot. She must have been the creature that had pounded on my door, despite the fact that these creatures have a reputation for being notoriously evasive. She had somehow stepped out of the natural rhythm of her reticent ways, over the threshold and boundaries of her comfort zone, to get my attention. Up until this point in time, I had truly believed Bigfoots were just creatures of pulp fiction, but now my presumptions were proved horribly wrong. The Bigfoot was standing there with the toddler on her shoulders, which she lowered and handed over to me. The toddler was crying in protest. It wanted to stay with the Bigfoot and wanted nothing to do with me. I took the toddler from the Bigfoot. She spoke to me in a strange tongue, but I understood her words, for they seemed to be automatically translated in my mind. I took the toddler. It was alone in the car. But you came to look for it, so I followed you home to bring him back to you. Amatila potapisafobo, amasina sonabo, inali nobo. I stared at the creature in awe, baffled by its supreme intelligence and human-like appearance. There are no words to describe how intimidating this ambiguous creature was. And despite the fact that she was so human, if I'd encountered her in the countryside, I might well have run a mile. She was lofty, majestic, incredibly impressive, She towered at 8 foot tall, was possibly about 700 pounds. I couldn't see her features clearly, as the moonlight remained reticent and subdued, still cloaked by a foggy mist, but the outside light from the front door highlighted her obscure features. The Bigfoot was covered in long flowing hair, and appeared to be wearing some kind of animal skin around her body. She was built like an army tank. She had small breasts and the most gentle human face I've ever seen, with deep-set dark eyes filled with a tender compassion. "Thank you," I said. The creature nodded. She turned around at one point and looked at me again, and nodded again. I stood there in the doorway with the toddler in my arms, as I watched the Bigfoot finally gliding away, until she was gone. The toddler began to scream again, especially after the Bigfoot had left him. It was clear where his priorities lay. I managed to calm him down, bringing him into the house. If the Bigfoot had called the toddler a boy, then I believed her. He was obviously a boy. By this time, my boyfriend Jonathan is standing at the bottom of the staircase, having been woken up by the child's screaming outbursts. "What the hell is going on? Where did he come from?" he asks, looking incredulous. "I don't know how to tell you this, Jonathan, because you're not going to believe a word I tell you, but I promise you it's true, as incredulous as it may sound. But a female Bigfoot dropped off the toddler a moment ago. She was banging on the door, so I opened it to her. She saw us looking for him earlier in the evening when we went back to the truck. She'd seen him alone in the truck, so she rescued the boy, obviously worried that he'd come to some harm or even freeze to death. She followed us back to our house to drop off the kid." "How do you know she did this?" "Well, she told me." My boyfriend looked bemused, as if I'd slapped him over the head with an axe pick, as he tried to assimilate what I was saying. "You saw a Bigfoot, and it spoke to you. Do you realise how crazy you sound?" "I know it sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. It appears to be able to communicate telepathically, even though it does speak in its own strange language." My boyfriend opens the front door, and when he sees the large trail of oversized feet in the snow leading directly back to the woods, he turns around to me and says, "Well, I believe you. Look at the size of those feet. Those were not made by a normal man." "You say the creature spoke to you in English?" "In my head, yes. It was telepathic." "Oh, goodness gracious, look!" I say to my boyfriend, lifting the toddler's nappy area to my nose. "He smells pongy. I think he's done a poop in his pants. And we don't have any nappies. What are we going to do?" I hurried off to clean the toddler up, and managed to find a thin hand towel and some safety pins to make him a makeshift nappy, and then I put him on the settee and covered him with blankets. "I've just been on the phone to the police," my boyfriend told me. "They'll be here in the morning to pick up the toddler." The very next day, a female and male officer arrived at our front door to pick up the toddler. "It's a very big blessing that you picked up the toddler," they told us. "The child's grandmother was taking care of the little mite. She was driving on those treacherous roads and went skidding to the side. She was very frightened about driving any further in those conditions. So she decided to go and get help at the farmhouse that she saw through the trees. She went to retrieve her grandson from the back of the truck, and clean forgot about him. She said she was feeling a bit strange, but she went to the farmhouse, knocked at the door, and had some kind of dreadful seizure. The kindly people gave her a room for the night. She panicked when she woke up in the morning, and suddenly remembered she'd forgotten all about her little grandchild. She hurried back to the car, fearing the worst, frightened by what she would find. She was certain her grandchild would have frozen to death overnight. She remembered she'd forgotten to shut the door after her. But when she got to the truck, her grandchild was missing. She was in a dreadful state about that, as the child's seat was still there, but the child was gone. She thought a coyote or fox had eaten him. So when you phoned to say you had the toddler, she was so relieved. Do you realize you saved that child's life? It could have frozen to death in that car." 1 week later, the door of my boutique tingled, and an elderly woman entered. She gave me a warm smile and began to ferret through my clothes very elegantly. She had a shock of white hair and pale blue eyes. I would put her in her late 70s, early 80s, although I couldn't be sure. She was an elegant woman who looked as if in her younger days she'd been a ballerina. It would seem her back was as straight as a pencil. She walked with a graceful deportment. She finally chose a couple of dresses to purchase and brought them over to me to the cash register for me to ring up. You know, I love your clothes. They're so incredibly feminine. They have a hint of the 50s about them, which is one of the things I like about them. One of my friends was wearing one of your creations the other day. I said to her, "You have to tell me where you bought that dress." Then she told me her best-kept secret, the name of your boutique, so here I am. "Glad to hear it," I said. "I think these clothes will look great on you." "Thank you, dear. I'm treating myself, especially after the shock I had last week. I figured I needed some spoiling." "What happened last week?" I asked. "Would you believe it? I was driving in the deep snow with my grandson. I had to look after him for my daughter. He's a toddler and he was sitting in the back seat. I'm a dreadful driver at the very best of times, and I had a full-blown panic attack driving in those treacherous conditions. I knew I couldn't go any further, so I climbed out of my truck with the full intention of getting help from a nearby farmhouse I'd seen not too far from the road. I became so disorientated and confused. I left my grandson in the back of the truck. I clean forgot about him, can you believe it? And when I reached the farmhouse, I had a full-blown seizure. The kindly couple found me a bed for the night, and when I woke up in the morning, I suddenly remembered I'd forgotten about my grandson, that he was still in the back of the truck. I was terrified he'd have frozen to death, because I'd left the door wide open. But when I returned to the truck, he wasn't there. The door was closed, but I knew I'd left it open, so I wondered if a coyote had got my grandchild, and that the heavy wind had blown the truck door shut. I phoned up the police at once, fearing the very worst, but someone had rescued my grandson. I've never been so relieved in my life. I do need to thank the person or the people that saved my grandson's life." "There's no need," I said, smiling. "You're thanking her right now. I was the one that discovered your grandchild." "Is this a joke?" she asked me. "No, it's not." "In that case, I must insist you join me for lunch today. My way of saying thank you." I would have liked to have given the Bigfoot full credit for her significant part in this story, but some secrets are best not shared. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.